a criatura de noite. Working as a forest ranger always felt like freedom to me. The forest, with its untamed life, always made me feel at home. I knew every trail, every bend. I'd seen it all, animals in their natural habitats, and even lost hunters trying to break the rules. But nothing could prepare me for what I saw that night. It was a full moon night, but strangely, the forest was too quiet. Normally, there would be sounds everywhere, crickets, distant howls, the rustling of leaves. But that night, the silence was almost absolute, as if all the animals had vanished. My instincts warned me something was wrong, that something was out there. I decided to do an extra round, holding my flashlight and with my rifle slung over my shoulder. I walked down the trail, the only sound being my own footsteps on the ground. After about half an hour of patrolling, I saw a glint between the trees. At first I thought it was my flashlight reflecting off an animal's eyes, but as I got closer, I realized this light was different. There was a figure crouched low, examining something on the ground. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved. It was tall, much taller than any human. I froze, watching as the creature slowly raised its head. Our eyes met, and my instinct screamed at me to run, but fear rooted me in place. Its eyes were what scared me the most. They didn't reflect light like normal animal eyes. Instead, they emitted an eerie, almost unnatural glow. The creature's skin was gray and wet-looking, shining in the moonlight. Its form was twisted, as if its bones were positioned in impossible ways. The creature started to rise, revealing its full height. It must have been over 2 meters tall with long, thin legs. Its body moved in utter silence, as if it bore no weight at all. Then, without warning, it took a step in my direction. The extreme sense of danger finally snapped me out of my trance, and I started to run. I didn't dare look back. Every sound I made seemed to echo through the forest, while the silence around me remained intact, as if the forest itself was watching, complicit in that dark encounter. I ran until I reached the ranger station, nearly breaking the door down as I entered. I locked myself inside, my heart pounding. My mind was a jumble of fear and confusion. I knew that thing was still out there, that it had seen me, that it now knew where I was. I spent the rest of the night locked inside the station, every little sound from outside making me jump. The creature didn't try to get in, but I could feel its presence, as if it were waiting, knowing I was terrified. And that's when everything began to make sense. The old stories, the reports of disappearances, the bodies found in strange conditions. The creature was real, a primal predator, perhaps older than the forest itself. The next morning, still in shock, I decided to seek out the oldest locals. Little by little, I realized that some of them already knew of the creature's existence. It was a local legend, something most chose not to discuss. They spoke of a creature that appeared on nights of absolute silence, a forest entity, a predator that hunted in secret. No one knew exactly what it was, but they knew enough to fear it. Since that night, my relationship with the forest has changed forever. Now, when night falls and the silence is complete, I know I'm not really alone. I know that in the shadows between the trees, there is a creature waiting patiently watching. No matter how much I try to avoid it, I feel that someday it will come for me again. The shadow on the trail. I've always loved hiking. Ever since I moved to a town surrounded by forests, exploring trails has been my escape from routine. I'm drawn to the most secluded paths, the ones few dare to take. There's something magical about being alone in the wilderness, with no civilization in sight. But that day, I learned that the forest holds secrets I probably should never have discovered. I'd heard rumors of a remote trail, known only by the oldest locals. They warned it was dangerous, and that hardly anyone ventured there. Naturally, my curiosity grew. With a map in my pocket, I set off in the morning, eager for an adventure. The trail started off calm. The tall trees formed a natural tunnel, and sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shadows across the ground. The sound of wind in the treetops was soothing, and for a while, I felt completely at peace. The forest was denser than I expected, but I didn't mind. The sense of isolation was exactly what I'd been looking for. After a few hours, the trail grew harder to follow. The trees crowded closer, and dense underbrush covered parts of the path. The forest seemed to close in, as though no one had walked this trail for years. That's when I heard the first snap. A distant sound, like a branch breaking. I brushed it off, assuming it was just a forest creature nearby. But the sound kept repeating, a snap, then another, always just a few meters behind me. I glanced back several times, but saw nothing. Only the empty trail and the shadowed trees. An unsettling feeling crept over me, like I was being followed, slow and insidious. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds continued. Soft, measured steps matching my own, always just out of sight. I would stop and turn around, but there was nothing there. Only silence, shadows, and a forest that now seemed to be watching. My steps quickened as I reached a clearing. The open space brought a momentary sense of relief. I thought that if something was following me, I would finally see it here. I stopped in the middle, breathing heavily, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The silence was absolute, as though even the wind had held its breath. And then I saw it. At the far end of the clearing, between the shadows of the trees, stood a figure. At first it was just a vague shape, but soon I realized it was something or someone standing watching me. A tall, dark shadow, featureless and colorless. Just a dark presence, unmoving. My heart raced. I tried convincing myself it was a trick of the light, an illusion. But then the shadow took a step forward. I froze. It wasn't an illusion. That thing was moving, silently coming closer. The open space of the clearing, which had felt like a safe haven, now left me exposed, vulnerable. The shadow kept advancing, slowly, menacingly. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran back along the trail, branches snapping behind me as though it was chasing me. I sprinted as fast as I could, refusing to look back, with the forest closing in on all sides. Branches scraped against me, leaves blocked my vision, but I didn't stop. At last, I saw the forest's edge. The sound of breaking branches halted the instant I stepped out of the trees. I turned around, expecting to see the shadow, but there was nothing. The trail lay empty, silent, as though nothing had happened. My entire body shook, sweat running down my face. The only thought in my mind was the certainty that I would never return to that forest. To this day, I don't know what that shadow was, a spirit of the woods, a lost entity, or something my mind conjured. But the sound of those snapping branches still echoes in my memory, a reminder that if I ever go back, the shadow will be there, waiting. The cabin in the clearing, exploring forests, has always been my escape. The silence of nature, the crisp air, and the utter absence of civilization always brought me a sense of peace I found nowhere else. On my days off, I loved seeking out the least touched trails, where I could walk slowly, uninterrupted by others. But on one of those ventures, I learned that some parts of the forest are best left untouched. This forest was particularly dense, with few trails and challenging paths. I had an old map, with faint trails nearly erased by time. I chose the most secluded route, wanting nothing more than to immerse myself in isolation. As I ventured further, the trees grew closer, and the sky vanished behind the thick canopy. As the day waned, I began looking for a safe spot to spend the night. That's when I noticed a clearing. In its center stood an old, weathered cabin, as though it had been forgotten long ago. The sight of that lone structure gave me a chill. The dark, moss-covered wood seemed to absorb the last rays of daylight. There was something unsettling about the place, but I brushed it off as fatigue playing tricks on me. The sky was growing dark, and the cabin was the only shelter around. I approached it, noting that the ground was littered with leaves and tangled roots, no sign of footprints. The door was slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze with a soft, persistent creak. Inside, the cabin was a scene of decay. Dusty furniture covered in cobwebs, and a strong smell of mold filled the space. The windows were so filthy that hardly any light seeped through. I could have camped outside, but the weather seemed ready to turn. The air felt heavy, and clouds thickened overhead. I decided to stay in the cabin. Settling in a corner, I used my pack as a pillow, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. In the dead of night, I woke with a start. A chill ran through me, and I lay still, waiting for any sign of movement. But the silence was absolute. Slowly, I rose and crept to the window. In the clearing, I noticed something strange. A tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was a dark silhouette, almost formless in the shadows. I stood there, transfixed, struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The darkness seemed to shift around it, swallowing it whole, then spitting it back out. The figure began moving toward the cabin. Its steps were slow and heavy, each movement distorted. I glanced at the door, uncertain of what to do. The figure approached, taking its time, as if in no rush. The air inside the cabin grew dense, and the temperature dropped sharply. Terror gripped me, rooting me in place. I felt a presence, something ancient and malevolent, watching me. Suddenly, I heard the sound of wood creaking right outside near the door. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it would pass, but the sound persisted, closer and closer, as if the cabin itself were yielding to the presence. The figure stopped at the threshold, and silence fell once more. I knew it was standing just outside waiting. The tension was unbearable, every second dragging on. Eventually, I heard the faint sound of steps retreating, fading into the forest. I didn't move until dawn, staying frozen until the first light seeped through the filthy windows. I left the cabin as quickly as I could, not daring to look back. Daylight brought a fleeting sense of relief, but I still felt that presence watching. As I left, I noticed the clearing was untouched, as though no one had been there. Grabbing my things, I hurried out of the forest, aware that something had followed me to the tree line. I never returned to that area, and to this day, the sound of creaking would remind me that some places in the forest hold secrets best left undisturbed. The forest of bodies. Since childhood, I had heard stories about a particular forest. My grandparents always warned me never to venture there, but their reasons were vague, shrouded in secrecy and silence. They would say that many years ago, bodies were found in the forest, deformed in inexplicable ways. The stories described twisted bodies, faces frozen in pure terror. The forest quickly gained a sinister reputation, and almost no one dared to enter it. These stories fascinated me my entire life. It was as if the forest itself were calling me, despite the danger. When I finally moved back to the town, I decided to investigate it for myself. I thought it was all just legend, old superstition. I was about to discover how wrong I was. On that cold morning, I packed my bag and made my way to the forest entrance. The sky was overcast, the air dense and heavy. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with vegetation, as if no one had passed through in years. As I ventured deeper, the trees seemed to form a dark tunnel, blocking out the sunlight and stifling every sound of the forest. I felt an inexplicable tension, but I continued, determined to reach the heart of that mysterious place. A few meters in, I stumbled over something. I looked down and saw a piece of fabric caught on a bush. It looked like an old piece of clothing, maybe from someone who had gotten lost there years ago. But as I picked it up, I realized the fabric was surprisingly fresh, as if it had only been torn recently. My unease grew. I continued forward, but the air around me felt heavier and the light dimmed, as though day were quickly turning to night. The forest grew denser, and the path disappeared into the undergrowth. The silence was broken only by a faint, continuous sound, a murmur that seemed to come from all directions. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind among the trees, but it quickly became clear that it was something else. The murmur sounded human, but distorted, like a voice trying to communicate, but unable to form words. I kept walking, my pace quickening, until something caught my eye. A few meters away, there was a shallow pit in the ground, surrounded by stones. As I approached, I realized it was filled with bones, human bones, broken and twisted at impossible angles. A morbid curiosity kept me from walking away. As I stepped back from the pit, a sound behind me made my heart race. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and approaching. I looked back, but the mist that had started to form among the trees blurred my view. My senses were on high alert, every fiber of my being urging me to get out of there. The footsteps grew louder, and as I moved forward, I realized the forest itself seemed to be closing in, as if the trees were shifting to block my path. Then I saw it. Among the trees, a figure was moving. Tall, abnormally tall. Its body was distorted and uneven, as though its bones had been broken and forced into unnatural positions. Its arms stretched awkwardly, and its head tilted at an angle that defied human logic. I wanted to run, to scream, but all I could do was stare. The figure began moving toward me, staggering and dragging itself. When it was only a few meters away, it turned its face, and what I saw was a nightmare, a frozen expression of horror, skin stretched tight, and eyes that were nothing but dark, empty holes. Finally, something inside me snapped, and I began to run with every ounce of strength my body could muster. The sound of footsteps grew louder, as if the thing were running too, trying to catch me. The path was nearly impassable. Branches and roots appeared like traps on the ground, and the mist clouded my vision. I felt the creature's presence drawing nearer. It was as if the entire forest were alive, conspiring to keep me there. I ran without stopping, terror consuming me completely, and for a moment, I thought I would never escape. After what felt like an eternity, the forest finally began to open. Daylight broke through the mist, and I stumbled onto the main trail, exhausted, my heart pounding wildly. The sound of footsteps stopped abruptly, and the presence vanished as if it had never existed. Panting, I looked back, but there was nothing. The forest was silent, the trees still, as if everything had been a dream. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew what it meant. I returned home that night, but the memory of what I had witnessed never left me. The stories were true. There was something ancient and evil in that forest, waiting, silent, for anyone who dared to trespass on its territory. If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.